Hey everyone, hey Tufty, thanks for tuning in. Let's go and recap my October reading. So in many ways, October was a really good reading month for me. I'm very pleased with how I got on. As usual, there'll be timestamps down below, so if you want to avoid the stats and just go straight into the books, you can do so. But otherwise, let's have a quick look at some numbers. So I read 8 books last month. One of them was a novella and another one was a shorter book, at least in terms of what I call a kind of an average read. It was a couple of hundred pages below my average for the year, so that almost feels like it should be a novella for me, even though it definitely wasn't. In total, I read 3,496 pages, taking my year-to-date page count to 28,626. As usual, I exclude novellas when I look at the average page count, but even taking that into consideration, the average for October was down a little bit, sitting at 485 pages. That is mostly due to the shorter book that I read, which was about 320. The average page count for the year is still above 500, currently sitting at 513. As far as the average ratings go, I landed on 4.0 for October, which has ever so slightly increased my average for the year. It's now sitting at 3.93. Onto the series stats, and I started 2 new series in October and finished 1, so I've now started 20 for the year and finished 5. I still haven't DNF'd any series this year, so series that I've been in the middle of, I've read at least 1 book and I was actively looking to continue with, but have since decided not to for whatever reason. So my total ongoing series that I've got at the moment is now up to 29, of which 12 of those I am fully up to date with, having read all of the books that have so far been released. And then days since the last 5-star read, again this is the spoiler aspect of the stats part of this video, that's now sitting at 31 days. So as usual, I'll run through the books in the order that I read them, or at least finished them, because occasionally I do have 2 books on the go at the same time, if I'm doing a physical or digital read and also an audio book. So the first book for October was my novella. This was Strangers in the Promised Land by Jim Wilborn. It's book 1.5 of the Continua Chronicles, meaning it's a follow-up story to the 7th Cadence, not one to be read before reading the novel. This one features 2 of the slightly lesser characters. They're not quite the main characters, they're more kind of supporting cast from the 7th Cadence. This is the 2 sisters, Amy and Mara Crewe, and I actually really quite liked these characters in the 7th Cadence, even though they didn't have quite as much screen time. I thought there was some good potential to their story and to their kind of character progression. And to be honest, that's exactly what I got from Strangers in the Promised Land, so I was really pleased with this. The writing was already going to be good because I know what to expect from that, having read the 7th Cadence and rather enjoyed it. And because it's a novella, there's obviously a lot less space, there's a lot fewer pages to get the story into, so you've got a very defined focus on the story that you're telling within those pages. And I think there was a really good job here with some great character development, some great situations that the sisters get themselves into, and also some really clever ways sometimes that they got out of those situations. So I was really pleased to have received a review copy of this from Jim and his publisher Emergent Realms, and I really enjoyed the story. Now I do have a slightly different rating system for novellas. I don't use my weighted ratings on a novella because there just isn't enough to go by for several of the categories, and even with a star rating I do look at it slightly differently. This one I ended up giving 5 stars to though, because I really had a good time with it. I thought it was a really good companion to the 7th Cadence, and if you have read the novel, I definitely recommend continuing with the series by going into this novella. Next up, I did an audiobook which was In the Orbit of Sirens by T.A. Bruno. This is book 1 of the Song of Kamaria series, which is a sci-fi set on a distant world. I quite enjoyed this one. It was a buddy read with my friend Nina, and we both had a pretty good time with this story. It's not one that I would call a hard sci-fi, although I did like some of the science and technology elements that we got in here, where there's a bit more explanation around things like space travel and the cryosleep that people go into when they've got these long space journeys. And without being overloaded by any stretch of the imagination, we got some good details thrown in there, and I particularly liked a little bit about removing any impurities from blood, so any blood blood-borne diseases and so forth would be eradicated as a result of this cryosleep. And there's also things that have been added there as well to combat the atmosphere of the planet that these people are going to. So some really good stuff there. The overall story was pretty good. There were some good characters in it. I'm definitely going to continue with this series, although I don't know when I will get to book 2. However, I do have the audiobook ready and waiting whenever I'm ready. This one I ended up giving 4 stars to because it was a good sci-fi read. It was also one of the finalists in last year's SPSFC, the first running of the self-published sci-fi competition, so it's got some really good pedigree and I can see why it got to that final. Next up was my shorter book. This one, as I said in the stats part, if you saw that, was around about 320 or so pages, and it was Child of the Flames by D.W. Hawkins. Now, I read the opening chapter, or part of the opening chapter of this one, a month or so ago as one of my first chapter reads videos. I looked at the first chapter of some fantasy books that were available to buy digitally on Amazon for nothing, rather than being made available as a special offer or anything along those lines. These ones are just permanently priced at $0, and I had a good time with several of the books that I picked from there. This one though I was really enjoying. It did have a very long opening chapter, so long in fact, given the page count of the book as well, that it wouldn't actually all fit within the free sample that you get on Amazon. So I picked up the full book and I continued reading it in October, and generally speaking I had a good time with it. Although I will say that the element that I really enjoyed, the part of the story that I really enjoyed from the bit of the opening chapter that I read, wasn't the overriding story for the rest of the novel. So I stopped when a second character came into it because it seemed like a good stopping point, and that character who was introduced kind of became the main character of the story, and we focused more on him rather than the young lady who was opening the book. So that one was slightly disappointing, and it did lead to my overall enjoyment and my overall rating not being as high as I thought it would be based on what I'd read of the opening chapter. So definitely a disappointment, but overall it was still quite an enjoyable read. I liked the magic that you had in here, although some of it was a bit convenient. There were some really good elements to it as well. I'm not sure if I'll continue with this series. I think it's quite a long series. I'm not sure how many books there are, but I think it is a series of 5+ books, so there's plenty to get your teeth into, even if the individual books within that aren't necessarily that long. This one I gave 3.5 stars to, but it would definitely, I think, have made it to 4 or above if it had continued a bit more in the vein of the opening part of the first chapter, rather than diverging and making that a lesser element of the book. Next up was a rare reread for me. I picked up the graphic audio of Blue Moon Rising by Simon R. Green. This was one of my gateways to fantasy, along with The Lord of the Rings. It was the first of the fantasy books that I read that really got me into the genre. So this one I credit more than any other book of getting me to where I am now with my reading. So with that in mind, it is an older book, it's classic fantasy, and it definitely has that classic fantasy feel. Some elements of it you would definitely say are cheesy. There's a bit of tongue-in-cheek humour in here, but I like that as long as it's done well, but also not overdone, and I think the balance was pretty good in this one. I liked the graphic audio, it definitely adds to the enjoyment of the book, and the other thing that added to my enjoyment was just the nostalgia, as I remembered various aspects of this. So this book has definitely been an influence on my reading life, but it's also been an influence on my writing life, although I don't really talk about that much. There were a few bits in here, a few elements that I recognised as I was listening to it and thought, without necessarily realising it, I've definitely taken some inspiration from this book. So overall it was enjoyable. Yes, it will score higher because of the nostalgia factor, and the graphic audio also increases the score, but I ended up giving this one 4 out of 5 stars, and I did definitely enjoy my reread. Next book I read was also an audio read, and this was We Lie with Death by Devin Manson. So I read the first book in the Reborn Empire series. It was actually last year. I didn't realise that it was quite so long ago, but I really enjoyed it. It was one of my favourite books of the year, and I don't know why it took me so long to get to book 2 in the series, but I really enjoyed it when I did. So this one I thought was a little bit strange in book 1 because it's a first-person story, but there are 3 different point of view characters, so you specifically get into the heads of 3 different people, whereas I'm used to multi-POV stories being told in the third person. In here, we get that, but we add to it as well. So there are more point of view chapters in here, more point of view characters, and I think I really benefited therefore actually listening to this one rather than physically reading it, because they did also have different voice actors for those different characters, and that made such a difference. It was almost like listening to it as a graphic audio, to be honest, because you had those different voice actors, and I really appreciated it. I thought it was a really good story overall, a good continuation of We Ride the Storm, and I'm now even more so looking forward to getting into the third book of the series, ready for the fourth and the final book in the series to come out early next year. So it's definitely an enjoyable read, taking what we got in We Ride the Storm and building on it in pretty much every aspect. So I ended up giving this one 4.5 stars because I had a really good time with it, and I'm looking forward to continuing that. Then I read Rise of a Ranger by Philip C. Quaintrell. This is book 1 of the Echoes saga, of which I think there are 9 books, and they are all similarly sized. So this is a real series to get into if you like self-published fantasy. This one definitely felt quite classic in the world building. There were a lot of kind of Dungeons and Dragons type monsters that we came across in here, and I quite liked that because it gave a kind of lighter touch to the story, which worked out quite well for me. Overall, I thought there were a lot of good points to this book. There were a few points that I wasn't quite so much a fan of. You might have seen in previous videos I've said that I'm not a great fan of the kind of magical school, and we had in here a kind of magical combat school which did take up a little bit too much of the book for my liking, but overall it was quite an enjoyable read and one that I've added to my ongoing series list, meaning that I'm looking at some point picking up book 2 and potentially beyond that. Overall I gave this 4 stars because it was a good time. I could have enjoyed it more, definitely, and I'm hoping book 2 and beyond will take the elements that I liked from this one, build on them and start raising that enjoyment even further. But it was a good opening to a series, so there's a good solid base for that to happen from. Next up for me in October was a continuation. I read book 2 of The Onyx-Born Chronicle by D.W. Ross. This is The Darkest Dusk. Now I quite enjoyed Cold from the North. I did feel like it was maybe a little bit rough around the edges in some places in terms of a writing style, and you will often get that of course from a debut novel. With this one being book 2, I didn't really find that at all. I thought that it was definitely more polished. You can see the difference in the writing style as the author is gaining more experience and kind of getting into his stride with the story and his own storytelling. I enjoyed this one overall. It's a good example of taking what you got from book 1 and building on it in pretty much every aspect. The character work was pretty good here. It's one of the definite highlights of this story and this series so far. So The Darkest Dusk definitely built on the characters, both in terms of having more characters introduced, but also the characters who came across from Cold from the North had some good growth, some good development to them, which I definitely appreciated. There was some good battles in here, and I definitely like a nice fantasy battle. There was an expansion of the magic compared to what we learned from book 1, and that's good because we already did the kind of initial exploration of magic, the almost school type setting in book 1. So here it was more learning and developing and showing what's been learnt on the field, and I definitely liked that. It was a bit tropey in places with these magical weapons and perhaps an over-reliance on them and the light wielders, the people who wield these weapons of light. But you get tropes in every fantasy novel, whether you like it or not and whether you see it or not. Here, I don't think it was something that impacted my enjoyment of it. It was just something that I definitely noticed as the term light wielders kept catching my eye as I was reading through the book. Overall, as I say, it was definitely enjoyable. It was a bit of a step up from Cold from the North in terms of the writing. It was probably on the same kind of level, maybe even slightly for me a step down in terms of the story, but it definitely builds for book 3, which I'm looking forward to potentially in November. This one I gave 4 stars to, and I'm looking forward to wrapping up the series and seeing how book 3 goes. And then the last book I read was one of the ones that I was probably most looking forward to. This is Children of Memory by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I got a review copy of this through NetGalley, and I left it until October because it's been released in the UK at least in November. I think it's January in the US that this one is coming out. So I really enjoyed Children of Time. It's definitely one of my favourite sci-fi books that I've read. There's so much great imagination and creativity in there, and I really enjoyed the story. Children of Ruin, book 2 in the series, was a bit of a step down for me. I didn't like some of the aspects on it which became kind of more prevalent as you got further through the book. And I was hoping that Children of Memory would kind of take us back a little bit and go back to the enjoyment level that I had with Children of Time. Sadly for me, it didn't work out that way. It was a very different story, as Children of Ruin was different to Children of Time, so Memory was different to the first two as well. We do have some characters that cross over from the first two books and appear in here, and obviously we've got new characters, new creatures or species or whatever you want to call them being introduced in here as well. I felt that the book started out very strong. I really like the idea of the colony ship, and they're searching out a new world, and on arrival they've got various problems with the ship and they're trying to sort those out so they can get down to the planet and start terraforming it and so forth, and I thought that was done really, really well here. I did feel like after that the storyline was kind of broken up a little bit into various different pieces, and it almost felt like it was all pulled back together in the wrong order. There were confusing time jumps where you would be introduced to a character and then you go back in time to when the other characters were introduced to this newcomer, and then you'd go forward and then you'd go back, and then you would have different viewpoints on things, and it all just felt a bit muddled. It felt, to be honest, a bit of a mess to me. But the one overriding thing that I took from this novel, outside of a jumble of emotions and jumble of thoughts that I had from the what I consider jumbled storytelling, the one thing that I really didn't like about this was the ending. It was quite an extended ending in terms of you had kind of the big revelation that I'm referring to as the ending, and then you had a lot of explanation around it and a bit of pointing out the foreshadowing and saying how this was always there and the characters and potentially the reader just never noticed it. But I just really didn't like the choice that was made, and it was a further downtick basically in regards to my enjoyment of the story, because I felt it was such a weak device to have there and really left quite a sour taste in my mouth, I suppose. So overall, you can probably tell this was my least favourite book of the month, even though Adrian Tchaikovsky remains one of my favourite authors. The writing in it, beyond the kind of jumbled storytelling, the writing in it was absolutely fine, as I would expect from a Tchaikovsky. It's just that my enjoyment of this one definitely wasn't on that usual Tchaikovsky kind of level. So this one I gave 3 stars to, and very disappointingly so. So despite ending on a low, as I said at the start of the video, I consider it to have been a really good month for me. I'm really happy with the books that I read, my overall feelings of them and so forth. Let me know in the comments down below what you think if you've read any of these, and also how was your month, what were your highs, what were your lows. So at this point, do the usual stuff. Give the video a thumbs up if you appreciate what you've seen. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. Check out the additional stuff in the description box below this video for all of my social media and support the channel links, including my book club Discord and my Patreon. I'll hopefully see you all again in the next video sometime soon. But until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye for now.